Okay. Now, we're going to take our first guest here. This gentleman is with the Texas Civil Rights Association?
Right.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Any rate, we're going to take him. He's calling in on the phone. He's in Austin, Texas, and we're going to go ahead and start with him right now. Brian, are you there?
Yeah, I am.
All right. We can hear you.
Great. I'm happy to be here.
Well, thank you. We're glad to have you. David's coming in. He's going to ask a few questions, too.
Hey, Brian, how are you?
Doing good. How are you?
I'm all right. That's the first time we heard each other's voice, huh?
Yeah.
Texas Civil Rights Project, Hank.
Oh, project. That's it. Yeah.
Go ahead, Brian. Tell us all about it.
About the project?
Everything. You have a lot on your plate, don't you?
Yeah, sure. And, I mean, jump in with questions at any time. Texas Civil Rights Project, we're a nonprofit in the Austin area. We do a lot of different civil rights litigation. I personally am devoted primarily to doing litigation on behalf of prison inmates regarding conditions of confinement and making sure they're constitutional.
Like the air conditioning. Did you hear me?
You asked me to come on tonight to talk about executive salaries and prison heat.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Well, go ahead and fill us in on executive salaries. That topic's come up quite a bit lately.
We were just talking about it out in the break room with the medical ladies here, Linda Pugh and Miss Karen D'Amico. Are you familiar with them?
Yeah, yes I am.
Yeah, we were all talking about the different salaries and how the sergeant is paid by the hour, the lieutenant gets salary, and a lot of times the lieutenant has to come in to do the sergeant's job because the sergeant doesn't get overtime.
Mm.
And it just goes on and on.
Which lowers morale. Of course, it lowers the cost for TDCJ, but that doesn't do a lot for the morale of the lieutenants who get called in on their night shifts and holidays. And
yeah, but then you got folks like Brian Collins, isn't that his last name? And the head of the medical department, and how many thousands of dollars do they make as their salary? Go ahead, Brian. Tell us all about it. You know more than we do.
Yeah, well, I tell people things have to be really bad in a prison when the interests of the inmates and the interests of the correctional officers walking the halls become, closely related to each other.
Right.
And I mean, both these issues tonight, I mean, prison heat obviously, but even officers' salaries are in that state where they're so bad that even I, as an advocate for inmates, really see the problem in it. The biggest thing with officer salaries for me, from my perspective, are two things. One is the fact that they've got so many vacant positions, which means that, just for basic security staffing, they're pretty much at a bare bones level in an awful lot of units. Not all of them, but particularly in units in remote areas, be pretty bare bones staffing. And that's just for security. That doesn't play into programming at all. We do, for instance, I've been doing a fair amount of litigation around religious liberties, making sure that folks have access to religious programming, which is a really big deal from a human rights perspective and also from a recidivism perspective. And the number one reason why TDCJ, the way it justifies denying religious programming to inmates most of the time, is that they have insufficient staff. So, I mean, there are all these unfilled positions, and then along with that, you have a high rate of turnover for the positions that they are able to fill. It's something like a quarter of correctional officers, like the frontline people, leave their position every year.
Right.
So you just have a constant influx of new people. And talking to inmates, one common variable you hear is that, for the most part, officers with more experience are the better officers to deal with. For a lot of reasons that make sense. I mean, just at a basic level, if there's an emergency in the unit, someone starts seizing up with a heart attack, or, there's smoke and there might be a fire, whatever it is, the guy with more experience is, generally going to handle that a lot better than the guy with less experience.
Sure.
I mean, that's part of it. I mean, the other part of it, too, is just dealing with officers. Like, again, with religious programming, I heard a story recently where a guy was talking about, needing a little bit of latitude with some scheduling to make sure they're able to get everyone in, and have enough time to do their program with what was counting all interfering with the programming. And it's the older officer, or the more experienced officers, excuse me, that are more likely to be flexible and, kind of work with you. And I think that, at a very basic level, newer officers can be a problem because they're more likely to be of a state of mind where they are kind of dehumanizing the inmates that they're working with.
Sure.
Whereas more experienced officers are, maybe not all of them are going to be past that, but an awful lot of them are a lot more likely to.
Well, they've found themselves in the position, and they've had time to settle in and get a little rhythm going.
Yeah, and they get to know guys on their unit.
Sure.
And they deal with them over time, and just all around, it's much better to have a more experienced professional correctional officers in a unit.
Right.
At a basic level, inmates would be better off if officers were making a more professional salary. The way it is now, it's a very low salary. For 26,000 correctional officers out there who are on the front line, it's capped. It is capped at $37,000 a year.
That's ridiculous.
And that's after many years.
And that's after many years. The entry-level salary is a lot lower. And in a lot of parts of the state, there's competition with, if there's any sort of oil being pumped out of the ground. People are constantly leaving their jobs on correctional units to go and do that. And actually, TDCJ is looking at a bigger crisis in that respect in the next few years because some of the biggest shale rock deposits in the state are, in a strip of Texas, basically, from Huntsville stretching westward. And so they're going to be pumping, in the next 10 years, they're going to be fracking and pumping a lot of natural gas out of the ground there. There are going to be a lot of jobs coming into the area, and they're going to have even more trouble keeping correctional officers on staff.
Unless we do something about the fracking.
Yeah. And so, in light of... I'm sorry, did you say tell us about the fracking?
No, I said unless they do something about the fracking.
Yeah. So, we'll see. But, in light of all that, it's outrageous. It came out that Brad Livingston got a 40% pay bump.
Right.
Which is, well over six figures added to his salary. But so many other people are getting, 20% pay bumps, bringing them up, another 5 figures in their salary. It's almost comical because the explanation that TDCJ gives is that they need to retain talent.
Right. Well, the talent they need is on the front line.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I lived with those guys, and you get the new boots in there, and they're hard-headed, and they're trying to make a name for themselves, and they tear up my house, and I really didn't have anything. They just made my life miserable.
Threw all your pictures and letters in the water.
Just everywhere. And I might even be at work and come home, and my personal belongings are everywhere in my cubicle, not in my cell, but in my cubicle, for anybody to go through. That's just the way the youngsters do it. But then the old guys, they kind of kick back and wait on you to mess up. They're not going to cause any problems. And you're right. Whenever the fire breaks out, I've seen them, and they're level-headed. They know how to get the mattress out of the cell because there's really nothing that's going to burn except the mattress and maybe some clothes.
Yeah, and drag it outside. Yeah.
They just drag it outside the cell and get it out. That way nothing else happens, and you don't have to worry about the inmate running up and down the run.
Some wisdom comes with maturity anyway.
Right. Go ahead, Brian.
So, yeah, and just along that line of conversations about where things have to be so bad before the interests of inmates and the interests of officers begin to line up really tightly is the issue of heat in prisons.
Right.
This has been an issue that's been getting a lot more attention within the last couple of years.
Especially with the pig barn.
Especially with the pig barn. Really, I think it started in the summer of 2012 when legislators began writing letters to Brad Livingston to ask him to explain why they were getting so many complaints about the intense heat in the prison units. But then, again, most recently, there was that story where TCJ was found to have entered into a contract for $750,000 to build air-conditioned facilities for pigs that they're raising. Apparently, baby pigs are very sensitive in high heat.
But they've already got them in the cattle barns.
Yeah.
Right. But they just don't put that on the news.
It's interesting that they determined that baby pigs are very sensitive to high heat. In California, I've been around some huge pig farms, and they're not air conditioned, and it's damn hot.
Yeah. See, Texas prisons, the condition there was an order that just came out in Louisiana for Angola, the prison that holds death row inmates in Louisiana.
Right.
It's 102 pages long, which is a really long order. The conditions that are described in that order are very similar to those in most Texas prison units. The judge in that case was writing about how the temperatures in the summer very frequently get over 100 degrees, and at times we're getting higher than 130 degrees, at least on the heat index. And those are the exact same conditions in the bulk of Texas prison units. Because, until 1980, there were only 18 prison units in Texas, or thereabouts.
Wow.
Today there are 109, which is, 3 fewer than a few years ago. 3 have been closed. And so most of the prison units have been built within the last 30-odd years.
Sure.
And most of those are one of two types. They're either a Michael prototype, like a high-security prison unit.
Right.
Or they're one of the, bowling alley-style units where they have state jails and transfer facilities and things of that nature. And TCRP is currently litigating wrongful death cases for inmates from both sets of units.
Right. What about the third one? There's a third style that's got the little 2,000-man unit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I guess my point is, though, the overwhelming number of units in TDC are, of one or two, of a handful of types that all display this common characteristic where in the summer they're consistently getting over 100 degrees and sometimes over 130.
Right.
Which, is kind of a remarkable situation. There are a number of systemic problems in the prison system, like health care, which you're going to hear about later.
Right.
Which, anecdotally is, anyone you talk to is going to talk about how horrible it is. But from a litigation perspective, it can be difficult to attack it on a systemic level, because so much is based on the personal experience and dynamics of each individual person being affected. But when you're talking about temperature, there is, just hard science that once the temperature gets over 100 degrees, people begin to face a very significant risk of heat exhaustion and heat stroke. And with heat stroke, your body's systems begin shutting down. That's why in the free world, hell, in Houston, when the temperature gets up to a certain level, the city officials warn people without air conditioning about the temperature, and they say if it gets really hot, you should take refuge in a public building or a mall or a library where they have air conditioning, if even for a few hours, because it can be lethal. And those are the exact conditions that are occurring in the bulk of the prison units in Texas every summer, like clockwork. You can just look at your calendar.
A lot of us used to take classes, go to the schoolhouse, or go to chapel, spend a lot of time in the chapel because of the air conditioning. And the units that have bowling alleys, what you're calling a bowling alley, they've got multi-purpose rooms in each building. And we used to try and figure out a way to have some kind of a class or a religious group or an AA meeting. We as an inmate, we were pretty smart about trying to figure out how to get in the air conditioning.
It's also interesting that you pointed out that most, the great bulk of these facilities have been built in the last 30 years. Across the country, prisons that are being built, particularly since the 80s, which is when most of them have been built, air conditioning is the standard.
Yeah.
It's readily available. Texas had to specifically ask for no air conditioning, because otherwise it would have been planned directly into construction.
Brian, I hate to cut it short, but we got about 2 minutes. Is there anything that you're just dying to tell us that you think that is major important?
Yeah, I think the takeaway for a lot of issues in prisons is that the bulk of the evils stem from underfunding. The legislature doesn't put enough money into the system to handle the number of people it's putting into the system. And I just got to point out that every year, 70,000 new people enter the prison system and 70,000 people leave. Most of the people who are going in, over half of them are going in for fewer than 2 years. Another quarter of them, another 25%, are going in for 3 to 5. Over 7,000, which is almost 10% of the people who are going into the prison system every year, are going in for drug possession. And that's fewer than a third of them, like a half of a third, maybe a sixth, are actually going in for a violent crime, which includes everything from, murder to robbery to indecency with a child. Everyone else is going in for a property crime or a drug crime. You know, take heat, for instance. They've said that they can't do anything about it because it would cost $55 million to air condition the prison system. Well, you know, it costs $18,500 to house a guy in the prison system for a year. I mean, that means 3,000 guys, which would be half of the people who are going in for drug possession. You kept 3,000 guys out of the prison system for a year, that would equal $55 million.
Yeah.
And drug possession is about the most lowball charge you can go in with. I mean,
that's why we preach education, not incarceration.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the most obvious example. But I mean, even with folks who are going in for like DWI or passing a forged instrument or minor larceny, or things like that. I mean, there's a whole litany of issues that could really, you could really deter people from criminal conduct by just putting them on probation.
Right.
You know, probation costs about $3,000 a year.
Well, well, Brian, we could probably go on and on and on with this topic, and we really thank you for coming on the air and talking with us.
Please come back.
Please come back. Talk with Burke Butler. We've asked her to be a part of our prison show gang, and we've given her a spot every 6 weeks.
Excellent.
So,
excellent. Burke, you're going to love talking to Burke. She's dynamite.
Yeah, she starts in January. I'd have to look at the calendar. It's like the 10th or the 14th, something like that. I'm not looking at a calendar right now, so I don't know what day that Friday is. But thank you very, very much. We really appreciate everything that you do, Brian. And we're gonna have to sign off, and we're gonna get the medical ladies in here. Okay?
Okay. Well, thank you so much. I was real happy to be on the show.
Thank you, Brian.
So he made an interesting point that in Texas we're not spending enough on prisons. Also in Texas we're not spending enough on educations, which would reduce the amount of money you needed in prisons.
Sí, pero no se me hace justo que la legislatura no quiera poner dinero para abrir más educación, pero sí para las prisiones. Y no se me hace justo que Texas, especialmente cuando se construyeron estas prisiones, Texas dijo que no quería aire acondicionado. Y todos nuestros inmates que están allá adentro, cómo sufren en este tiempo de calor.